Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the Rupa Subramanya Show. I am Rupa Subramanya. In today's episode, we are honored to have Brendan O'Neill. He's a prominent British journalist and author. He joins us to discuss his latest book, A Heretic's Manifesto, Essays on the Unsayable. In his book, O'Neill fearlessly challenges the prevailing orthodoxies and dominant narratives that have taken over society. With clarity and insight, he examines contemporary beliefs surrounding gender, identity politics, racism, and climate change, questioning the uncritical acceptance and dogmatic nature of these ideas. In his essays, O'Neill advocates for the resurgence of heresy and dissent in our increasingly polarized world. He calls for a return to reason, open debate, and the pursuit of truth, values that he believes are crucial for a thriving society. Join me as we delve into these arguments and ideas presented in his book and explore the importance of challenging prevailing narratives, promoting intellectual diversity, and reinvigorating Enlightenment thinking in our modern age. Well, welcome to the show, Brendan. It's a real honor to have you here, and I just absolutely loved reading your book. Let me start by asking you, your book starts with a provocatively titled chapter, Her Penis, and does a brilliant job documenting how this term regularly shows up in news reports, in outlets and publications, especially in the UK. And these are publications across the ideological spectrum, left to right. Why does this term, what does her penis really mean, and why does this term matter so much?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on the podcast. Absolute pleasure to be on. Thank you for that question. Lots of people are quite struck by the first chapter because it is quite a confronting chapter. And I wanted it to be a confronting chapter. And the opening sentence in the book is, we need to talk about her penis. And I mean, it's funny on the one hand, and it's kind of, I think it probably makes people laugh, but it also, I think, drags them headfirst into the questions that I want to raise with my book, which is really about how language is being manipulated in order to manipulate thought. I think that's one of the great and terrifying themes of our times. And one of the points I make in the introduction to the book is that I'm increasingly of the view that the term cancel culture is not sufficient to describe the era that we're living in. I understand the attraction of the term cancel culture. It's short, it's alliterative, it makes sense. Many, many people understand what you're talking about when you say cancel culture. So I get it and I use it. But I think we have to look beyond that and understand that we're living through a period of counter-enlightenment, a period of extraordinary intolerance, a period of new forms of authoritarianism, which I think are designed to alter not just what people say, but how they think in their minds and how they relate to other human beings. So the reason I opened with that chapter, Her Penis, is just to use that two-word phrase as an example of how everyday language is changing around us, sometimes imperceptibly, sometimes without us really noticing. You wake up one day and suddenly her penis is an acceptable phrase that people are using in the media, in courts of law, in the political sphere. We have the leader of the Labour Party here in Britain, Keir Starmer, keeps getting into trouble because he can't answer the question, what is a woman? And his most recent answer, he said, look, 99% of women don't have a penis, which opens the possibility that around 1% do have a penis. And so the way in which ideas that we took to be true and scientifically provable and useful for understanding ourselves and other people, the way in which they can be overhauled in such a slippery way and without any protest, or really without very much discussion, I find that worrying. And I think it suggests we live under a new kind of cultural authoritarianism, which values people's subjective views of themselves over objective reality. And that's something I think we need to question and push back against.
So why does it feel like, just sticking to that first chapter, I was struck by the fact that pretty much everybody across the political and ideological spectrum seemed to be on board with the use of pronouns and gender ideology in general. What is going on there? Did some kind of a consensus emerge that we're not aware of? I mean, and how do we explain this consensus?
Yeah, it's really striking.
Yeah.
The speed, I think, historically speaking, the speed with which it became elite consensus opinion that you can change sex. And in fact, going even further than that, the idea that there is such a thing as a gendered soul, which might not match up with your biological casing, I consider that to be a pretty religious idea, a quite superstitious idea. It's not something that I believe to be true. I think it's an idea that is born from the narcissistic needs of a small group of people, which then gets embraced by the establishment as a politically correct value, an idea that you all must bow down before. But I don't accept the idea of a gendered soul. I don't accept the idea that there are men out there who are really female, they have a female brain or a female soul. I think that's quite a misogynistic idea. There's more to being a woman than feeling. There's more to being a woman than just desiring to be one in your mind. And I don't accept the idea that young women, who are the growing number of people undergoing hormonal intervention and sometimes surgical intervention, growing numbers of them are young women. Very often they're young lesbians. I'm deeply disturbed by the fact that we now live in a society in which a young lesbian can be subjected to hormonal interventions to correct her, to make her the correct sex, as if there's something wrong with being an 18-year-old girl who is attracted to other girls. Really, she must be a man. Let's change her. And one of the points I make later on in the book, I talk about the case of Alan Turing, the great computer expert, science hero of the Second World War and the mid-20th century here in England. He was, of course, famously arrested for homosexual behavior. He was given a choice. He could either go to prison or he could undergo hormonal treatment, which was really a form of hormonal castration. So he was given estrogen, which gave him breast material. It made his voice more high pitched. It made him very, very depressed. He didn't want these changes to take place. It basically feminized him as a way of neutering what was seen as his sinful homosexuality. Now, we look upon that with absolute horror today. And Britain is often trying to make amends for its grotesque treatment of Alan Turing. We recently put him on the £50 note here, which is a great honor in this country, basically as a way of apologizing for what we did to him. And yet we now do the same thing to young people in the 21st century. We do the exact same thing. We give young men hormonal interventions that give them the appearance of having breasts, which make their voices high-pitched, which make them the supposed correct sex, which give them the same sexual problems that Turing suffered as a consequence of his estrogen treatment. But we call it transgenderism. We call it gender affirming healthcare. We give it all these euphemistic names, which I think is really quite Orwellian and is a bit of a disguise for something that's actually quite problematic. So the fact that all of these things are kind of nodded along by so many different sections of the political establishment, I think that speaks to the absence of critical thinking. It speaks to a culture of conformism. So few people are willing to deviate from elite consensus opinion, especially if you're in the elites and you want to stay in the elites. You want to move in those circles. You want to have those opportunities, make those advancements. You can't break away from elite consensus opinion in that situation. So it reinforces itself all the time through the necessity of maintaining the elite group itself. Yeah. And they speak in their own language. They have their own special linguistic cues. They say, my name is so-and-so, my pronouns are such and such. They have these rituals that you have to perform in order to be a member of that class. And the fact that performance is a continual demand of people within that strata of society means that it is constantly being reinforced, and then it goes reinforced through education, through the university system, through popular culture, through social media, and it has this drip effect into the young generation in particular. So yes, there's a real culture of conformism, and one of the reasons I wrote my book and called it a Heretic's Manifesto is precisely because I think we need some more heretical kickback against ideas that have bizarrely become quite conformistly accepted.
Yeah, I found this sentence very striking in that first chapter. You say that her penis is a term that even rape victims might have to utter at some point. It really, when you put it that way, it's really quite jarring. It really puts it into context. How do you think that this impacts social cohesion, for example?
I think it's having a devastating impact, even though if we can't quite appreciate that yet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm lucky enough to live on Turf Island. Britain is often referred to as Turf Island, especially by some American activists. They can't believe we have so many trans exclusionary radical feminists here, which basically means women who don't accept the idea that a man can become a woman. J.K. Rowling is at the top, and there are many, many others. I'm really happy to live on Turf Island. I'm happy to live on an island where there are so many women who are speaking out and standing up for their sex-based rights, and taking action to defend their spaces and their freedoms. I think that's a really positive thing. But I think in relation to the question of how we got to a situation where lots of other sections of society, including law and the police, now accept a term like her penis. I mean, that is really the question of our age. How do these things happen? So, for example, there was a freedom of information request to police forces here in the UK, asking them if they record crimes as having been committed by a man or a woman, depending on their sex or on how they identify. And many police forces said they record crimes as by the preferred gender of the alleged criminal rather than by his or her biological sex. And some police forces even do that with rape. So rape is defined in English law as the non-consensual insertion of a man's penis into various parts of a woman's body. That's how it's defined in law. And yet the police have taken it upon themselves to accept the idea that the male rapist standing before them is a woman if he says he's a woman. And what you end up with is something really creepy, I think, something straight out of 1984. One of Winston Smith's jobs in the Ministry of Truth was to rewrite old newspaper articles to make them conform with the ideology of the current ruling party. That's what's happening now. So we have news articles here in Britain, and I've seen them around the world as well, where they will say woman arrested for rape of a minor. And it's just not true. That's a lie. That headline is a lie. Much of the article itself is a lie. It wasn't a woman, it was a man. And one of the examples I give in the book is of a story that was in the New York Times, which said and it was on the BBC as well, BBC News, 83-year-old woman arrested for murdering and decapitating a woman in her 60s. And I saw this headline and I thought, hold on, 83-year-old women don't do that. I can't think of any instance in my lifetime where an 83-year-old woman has murdered another woman and decapitated her. 83-year-old women tend to be quite small, quite frail, certainly not murderously inclined. Of course, it wasn't an 83-year-old woman. It was an 83-year-old man who had murdered women before. So the New York Times was lying to us. The BBC was lying to us. You had to get to the very last line of the BBC article to find out that this is a transgender woman, i.e. a man. So they're lying to us. And one of the consequences, there are numerous problematic consequences there. Firstly, if the media doesn't tell us the truth about something as serious as an act of rape or an act of murder, why should we trust them to tell the truth about anything? And when the media elevates ideological needs over objective recording of facts, that calls into question the entire pursuit of truth and whether the pursuit of truth is even possible in an era in which subjective delusions now count for more than objective reality. But then one of the bigger problems, as you've alluded to, is that we end up in a situation where rape victims feel pressured to refer to their rapists as female. And one of the points I made in my book is, firstly, they rape you, then they get your pronouns. And if you think about that, the impact of that New York Times article on the women that man had harassed and assaulted and killed over numerous decades, it was depriving them of the right to tell their story. Their story is that they were attacked by a man. They were brutalized by a man. That's not only their truth, it is the truth. And they were being subtly deprived of that by a supposed newspaper of record, which took it upon itself that to say that the rapist and the murderer's truth is more important than their truth. And that is a judgment that I think goes against not only reason and objectivity, but against human decency. Yeah. And so when you have a situation where political correctness is overriding human decency itself, I think we're really reaching a sad situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the key themes in your book is the importance of free speech and your concerns about the rise of compelled speech. Here in Canada, there are several instances, where free speech has been suppressed, and the chilling effects, cancel culture, for lack of a better term. I agree with you. It sounds rather benign. I agree with your criticism of the term. I think we need something else that captures captures the importance of what's going on. The chilling effects cancel culture has had on free speech. I've interviewed like a 17-year-old high school student here in Canada who was recently suspended from his Catholic high school for protesting against gender ideology. Compelled speech and all of this is clearly very, very problematic. And you say the free speech is important and the right to offend is also very important. But in a world of unfettered free speech, does something such as hate speech exist?
I think I have a real problem with the term hate speech. I've always felt uncomfortable with the idea of hate speech. Obviously there is racist speech, there is misogynistic speech, there is anti-Semitic speech, there's Holocaust denial, there is white supremacist speech. No one denies that those forms of speech exist. They're on the internet, people can see them. I'm such a free speech absolutist that I think even that kind of speech should be free. It should not be interfered with by the state, because I think there's a benefit from knowing that kind of speech exists, because it allows us to see what these hateful individuals and hateful groups are saying, what they're thinking, where they are, where they need to be challenged, where they need to be confronted. I think there's a real danger, even when we're talking about genuinely racist speech, there's a danger that suppressing it will actually allow it to fester and grow in new communities online, hidden from reasoned society. A really good example of that is France. France outlawed Holocaust denial 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, a long time ago. Now France has a very serious problem with anti-Semitism and with anti-Semitic speech, a very serious problem, arguably the most serious problem in Western Europe, if not the whole of Europe. And I think that's partly a consequence of the censorship. Not entirely, of course. There are numerous social and cultural issues in France that mean that all sorts of regressive views take hold in certain sections of society. But one issue is the censorship. So this stuff has to go underground. The Holocaust deniers have to hide away, make their own websites and so on, and make their own little networks. And therefore, it's difficult to call them out or to highlight them and to challenge them. So even genuinely hateful speech, I don't think should be censored. But I think the problem I have with the term hate speech is that so much stuff gets collapsed under that term. Yeah. So it's not just the racism and the anti-Semitism and the misogyny and whatever. It's also J.K. Rowling writing a brilliant, long, considered essay about women's rights. That is now transphobia. That is a form of hate speech, apparently. Or it's people who criticize mass immigration and who say that there needs to be some form of controls on immigration. Now, as it happens, I'm quite liberal on immigration, which gets me into all sorts of trouble with some of my allies on other issues. But there you go, that's life. But there are many people who are critical of mass immigration, and they get called racist. That's the xenophobia. And even, just to take the example of Brexit here in the UK, I think Brexit was a very important working class revolt against the technocratic elites, against the new elites. And the people who voted for it, which includes me, we're called Europhobic, we're called xenophobic. We voted out of a place of hatred. So all sorts of things, even genuinely held, perfectly legitimate political views are now redefined as hate speech. And one of the points I make in the chapter in my book on hate speech is that I think one of the issues with this branding of certain views, one of the paradoxes that I talk about is that we live in societies that are absolutely obsessed with controlling and suppressing hateful speech. and yet public life feels more hateful than ever. It's such an interesting paradox to me.
Yeah.
I mean, hatred is the lingua franca of social media, when they have the Twitter mobs and they are the things they say about gender critical feminists, or about Black members of the Conservative Party, or about someone like Priti Patel, who was our Indian heritage Home Secretary here for a few years. They say the most obscene things. Woke people say it. People who have words like love is love in their Twitter bios, and the pride flag, and of course their pronouns. People who in every other situation would say they are against hatred. Or if you look at university campuses, they are awash with speech codes controlling hate speech. And yet if a pro-Israel person turns up, or a gender critical feminist turns up, there will be orgies of hatred. They will smash windows, the students, they will scream abuse. So one of the points I make is that I'm worried that the empire of hate censorship that we all live under now, where we all live under states that want to control supposedly hateful speech, actually green lights hatred. Because what it does, it hangs a sign around people's necks which says that this person is a hateful person, a bad person, they are destructive to social life. Whether it's a gender critical feminist, or someone on the right, or a Canadian trucker, or a Danish trucker, or a Dutch farmer, anyone who deviates in any way from the consensus, they are hateful people, and therefore you may hate them. In fact, you must hate them, because unless we cleanse society of their dangerous ideas, we're all in big trouble. So I think that's the paradox of hatred. It presents itself as an attempt to control hatred in society, but it actually gives us a license to loathe certain groups and certain people, and it exacerbates hateful discussion in contemporary life.
In this chapter, the love that dare not speak its name, you refer to a therapeutic turn in society from one of liberation to a more managerial, technocratic society in which our individuality has been diminished. I found this very striking. It was possibly one of the most interesting things that I saw in the book. What do you mean by this, and can you elaborate?
So that chapter is specifically on the rise of woke homophobia.
Exactly.
And so the way in which I guess the argument I'm making in that chapter is that all the progressive ideals that we sometimes take for granted, I'm using the word progressive in the English sense, which means something good. I know it has different meanings in different parts of the world. But the progressive ideals that we take for granted can easily fall away if we're not vigilant, and if we don't defend the freedom to think and to speak and to defend those ideals. So I think what's happening with the trans ideology and its impact on young gay people in particular, I find incredibly worrying. But one of the points I make in that chapter in talking about that issue, as you say, is that I think one of the big differences, I think one interesting thing about woke activists and the woke elites is that they see themselves as the heirs to the progressives of the 1950s and the 1960s. They see themselves as the heirs to the civil rights movement in the United States, or the gay liberation movement across the Western world, or of course the feminist movement, the second wave feminism in the 60s and the 70s. They see themselves as the heirs to that. And my argument is that actually they are the opponents of that. They are a blot on those progressive leaps forward in human history. And that's why I get very frustrated when people say that anyone who criticizes wokeness or political correctness just wants to turn the clock back to a time when women were in the kitchen and Black people and white people were segregated and gay people didn't have normal lives. For me, it's the entire opposite. It's the fact that those breakthroughs were made in the Western world and were very positive, that I am now concerned about this movement and this ideology that I think is threatening them. And so I think generally speaking, what's happened is we've gone from a culture of liberation, we've gone from movements that wanted to free themselves from state intervention, state control, the judgments of the moral majority, as it was referred to, who basically argued for autonomy, for the right to live freely and for the right to make their own choices. So that was the women's movement, the gay liberation movement. The civil rights movement, basically leave us alone. Frederick Douglass, going back to the 1800s, he was the slave turned abolitionist, he was once asked, what can the white man do to help freed slaves? And he basically said, just leave us alone. Just let us get on with it. Yeah. Some of us will fail, some of us will succeed, but just give us the freedom to try. Yeah. So that was the kind of culture that we had in these progressive movements over the past 60, 70, 80, 100 years. Mm-hmm. I think what we have now in the woke movement is the precise opposite. We have a movement that is very authoritarian, that is constantly seeking validation from the state rather than freedom from the state, which wants everyone to respect it, to respect its pronouns, to bow down, to genuflect to its ideologies. And if you don't, you're in big trouble. They will cancel you. They will no platform you. So it's the polar opposite of the culture of liberation. What we live under now is a managerial regime in which we are all expected to submit to the expertise of lifestyle gurus, the welfare state, other social actors who presume to know better than we do ourselves how we should run our lives, how we should live, how we should raise our children, how we should speak, how we should think. So the drift from a culture of leave us alone and let us live freely to a culture in which people don't trust themselves to be free, and instead call on the authorities to recognize them and look after them and tell us exactly how to raise a child in the first 6 months and exactly how we should speak to a person of a different race in the workplace and exactly how we must make ourselves felt and what words we should use. There's this desire to be told all the time how to behave and what to do. Yeah, I think that's so worrying, and I long for that older era in which people said, look, we're capable of running our lives, let us do it.
So, but how did we get to this point? How did we get from this liberating force that gave us women's rights, gay rights, to this present morass of some bewildering confusion of gender and sexual identities? How did we get to this point? That's the question that I'm often, I often ask. I don't really have the answer to it.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and there are so many different cultural factors and changes in society that I think contribute to that. One idea I've had, which is difficult to articulate, and I'm not even sure if I'm right, is that I think it's a paradoxical situation where some of these liberatory movements, which I think were very positive, possibly contain the seed of their own demise and possibly contain the seed of the culture that we currently live under. Mm-hmm. So Elizabeth Lash Quinn wrote a brilliant book about race experts maybe 20 years ago. And she just looked at how the civil rights movement itself, which she is entirely in favor of, and the heroic Martin Luther King, of course, she said that it gave rise over time to an academic culture of not liberation from segregation and oppression, but racial management of the relations between the races, a need to control how Black people and white people interact. And of course, that now has exploded into the most poisonous racial culture in workplaces and so on, where you have people like Robin DiAngelo, the queen of white fragility, and her book being used in workplaces across the Western world to basically reprimand white workers, divide them from Black workers, enforce these new forms of racial workplace management. I would say it's very beneficial to the boss class. That's one of the most striking things about identity politics. So there are some people, and I think if you look at the gay liberation movement, for example, I think the way in which it went through various different phases, I think the AIDS crisis played an enormous role in weakening its desire for autonomy and giving rise to this desire for medical protection, for bringing homosexuality back under the purview of the medical elites, which it had only just liberated itself from. So there's that factor as well. But I think generally, if we're looking at the different cultures, I think the rise of a therapeutic culture, which emphasizes people's weakness rather than their strengths, emphasizes their incapacity rather than their capacity. Also, a changing political culture, especially on the left, moving away from one that believed in individual sovereignty and freedom to one that believed that the structures of the welfare state must play a more important role in how people run their lives. And then on top of those two, a general downbeat culture in the West, particularly post-Cold War, when the life seems to be sucked out of Western politics, it starts to lose its dynamism, however phony that dynamism might have been in the Cold War era. There was at least some sense that the West was the free world and the East was the unfree world. So there was an element of dynamism and confidence in the West. And then even that gets drained away. So I think the rise of the therapeutic culture, the shift of the left in particular, and that includes much of the professional managerial elites, away from believing in sovereignty and freedom towards believing in social control, and a general culture of misanthropy and mistrust across the West. I think they all played an important role in dragging us, I think, over 3 or 4 decades from a period in which we expected to be free into this new period and we expect that we will be controlled.
Yeah. You have a chapter on Islamo censorship, where any criticism of Islam is canceled and termed as racist, Islamophobic, a term that I hadn't heard of, hijabophobia, where criticism of the hijab is seen as hijabophobic. How did we get to this situation where Islam essentially has this cordon sanitaire erected around it by the thought police, but it's certainly not the case when it comes to Christianity, for example, or Hinduism, where regressive practices and fundamentalists are routinely called out by the same progressive elite who now bend over backwards to shield Islam from similar legitimate criticism.
It's just extraordinary. I find the culture of censorship around Islam to be so terrifying and chilling and really problematic for, I think, social stability. I think it has a profound impact on society that I think lots of people don't appreciate. I mean, the point I make in that chapter is that it's just extraordinary that in the UK, for example, we had the fatwa against Salman Rushdie in the late 1980s, issued by Iran, of course, but supported by significant sections of the Muslim community in Britain. Salman Rushdie is a British citizen, not born in Britain, but he's a British citizen. He's also a Knight of the Realm here. He's a Sir. So he is very important to this country. There was a willingness among some sections of the cultural elite to protect him. Others kind of slightly abandoned him and said, well, if he hadn't been so mean about Islam, he wouldn't be facing these problems. There was a culture of cowardice as well. But at the same time that Iran was issuing this death threat, this death warrant against a man for being rude about Islam, the British civil society itself was coming up with new rules and regulations to prevent people from being rude about Islam. It's such an extraordinary moment in cultural history where one of the most famous authors of our time is laboring under a death warrant while civil society is inventing the idea of Islamophobia, or at least pushing it further and further. So the Runnymede Trust is an anti-racist charity here in Britain. It really came up with the contemporary definition of Islamophobia in the mid-1990s. So we're talking 4 or 5 years after the fatwa. And it defined Islamophobia as hostility to Islam. And it very clearly makes the case that it's not just racist abuse aimed at people from the Muslim community. I don't know anyone who would disagree that racist abuse against brown Muslims, as most of them in Britain are, I don't know anyone who would disagree that that's a terrible thing and society has a responsibility to keep it in check. But it was talking about hostility to Islam. It was talking about even terms like Islamic fundamentalism. It says is an unacceptable term because it's offensive to Muslims to tie the word Islamic to the word fundamentalism or the word terrorism. The Muslim Council of Britain, which is an organization here, has taken this idea even further, and it recently criticized the Daily Mail because it interviewed one of the Yazidi women who had been enslaved and raped by ISIS. And she said during the interview that the people who were oppressing her and raping her, they thought it was sanctioned by Islam. And the Daily Mail quoted her words, and the Muslim Council of Britain rebuked the Daily Mail, saying it's unacceptable to suggest that ISIS is driven by Islamic ideas. even though these were the beliefs and the words of a woman who had experienced the most extraordinary horrors, I just found that staggering and extraordinary. And the police here in Britain, the counter-terrorist police in London, have openly discussed, they haven't done it yet, but they've openly discussed moving away from terms like Islamic terrorism or Islamist terrorism to using phrases like faith-claimed terrorism.
Oh.
And they're talking about not using the word jihadi and instead using the word terrorist or something. So, and if you look at their discussions, what's very interesting is they openly say changing the language in this way could be a way of improving community relations. So again, you have the manipulation of language to manipulate how people think. And the truth of the matter is the vast majority of terror attacks in Europe over the past 10 years have been Islamist terror attacks. Hundreds of people have been killed in Europe, hundreds, including 21 at the Manchester Arena here in Britain, yep. One of the worst terror attacks of all time in this country. I was at a Morrissey concert earlier this year, and it was really interesting because obviously Morrissey's from Manchester, and he said to the audience, you all know the name Myra Hindley, but none of you know the name of the man who blew up the Manchester Arena. She killed 6 kids. He killed 21. So why don't you know his name? The audience just went quiet. Wow. But I thought it was a very good question. And I think there is this culture of amnesia around Islamist terrorism. We're encouraged to forget. We're encouraged to move on. We all sang the Oasis song, Don't Look Back in Anger, after the Manchester Arena bombing, which summed up our attitude to these atrocities. And more broadly, there is this culture of, there's this rather racially paternalistic culture coming from the woke left and from the elites, which says Muslims need to be protected from offensive speech and rigorous discussion about their religion, and therefore we're going to censor it. And everyone loses out as a consequence of that. We lose out our freedom of speech, our freedom to criticize one of the great world religions. And the Muslim community is effectively reduced to a second-class community who require special measures to protect, unlike any other community, they require special measures to protect them from ideas that they might find difficult or challenging. And that infantilizes them. So it infantilizes public discussion, and it infantilizes Muslims. So I find it a curiously racist idea, and one that, of course, is a grave assault on freedom of speech.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You also advocate for intellectual courage and the willingness to challenge prevailing orthodoxies. How do you suggest that people do this? One of the things that I encounter very frequently is that people are just people will privately agree with you, but they're very, very afraid to come out publicly and take a position or come on the record. Because they have genuine concerns. They might lose their job, their kids might get suspended from school, and so on and so forth. The list goes on. How do you suggest people develop these qualities in a society that is increasingly very discouraging of dissent?
It's such a good question, and it's a difficult one to answer because I often say, we have to have the courage of our convictions and say what we believe and so on. But that's quite easy for me to say because it's my job to do that, and that's what I do for a living. So I guess I'm in a privileged position to use contemporary language. I know it's more difficult for other people. I know that there are women. I get emails very often from women in particular. If I say something on TV or radio that is gender critical, I get email from women saying, "I wish I could say this. I'm glad I can't say it. I'm glad you're saying it." And there are other issues as well on which people feel that they can't speak out because there is a stifling culture. And I think one of the grimmest impacts of cancel culture is not, people will often say, well, look at J.K. Rowling, she's still speaking, or look at Kathleen Stock, the British professor of philosophy who has got into a lot of hot water for her gender critical views. They will say, look at Kathleen Stock, she speaks at Oxford, she writes newspaper articles. I think that's missing the point. The point of cancel culture is the chilling effect it has across society. It's the message it sends to people who have less power than J.K. Rowling, who have less money than some people, who have less job security. who know what will happen to them if they speak out. They know they will suffer enormously. So it's very difficult. But even having said that, I do think the people who can speak out must speak out. And I think they're the ones I'm least forgiving of, are those people who are in the media, who do have a platform, who are fairly comfortable, who are not likely to get sacked because of the position they're in, when they don't speak out on certain issues, on the encroachment of wokeness into reason and truth and freedom. When they don't speak out, I find that incredibly worrying and disappointing. And I give an example in the last chapter of the book. I give a few examples from history, in fact, of people who spoke out in circumstances which were far more difficult than ours. So I tell the story of William Tyndale, for example, who is one of my heroes. He was a quite zealous Protestant reformer in England in the early 1500s. And he translated the Bible into English, which was an offense punishable by death. If you published the Bible in English, it was only supposed to be in Latin because only our moral superiors were allowed to read it. And the rest of us had to just nod along to whatever they decided to read to us in church on a Sunday. If you published the Bible in English, you were burnt at the stake. And he thought, no, I have to do it. He went to Germany to do it. You couldn't do it in England. He smuggled his Bibles back into England. His supporters would read the Bibles by candlelight and be ready to throw them away if anyone knocked at the door. I mean, that's the risk they were taking to exercise their freedom of conscience and their freedom to read. And eventually the authorities caught up with him. He was hunted as an outlaw across Germany. They caught up with him. They imprisoned him. They found him guilty of heresy. They strangled him to death, and then they burnt him at the stake. And you just think to yourself, what drove him to keep doing this? What drove him to keep publishing his Bibles, keep translating the Bible? He also invented the pocket Bible so that people would have a smaller version of it that they could hide away. What made him do this? And you just think it's because he was so convinced of his right to read the Bible, and he was so convinced of ordinary people's ability to understand things for themselves, which at the time was a completely revolutionary idea. And arguably it's become revolutionary again under the woke tyranny that tends to treat ordinary people as idiots who need to be protected from offensive ideas. It was a revolutionary idea, and one that he was willing to give his life for. And I just think those examples from history are really instructive, and which is why I tell some of them in the book. Instructive for those of us who want to put our heads above the parapet and who think that the risk is worth it. Because what we're talking about here is defending truth, reason, scientific reason, objectivity, equality, freedom, tolerance, freedom of speech. These are values worth risking your reputation for and worth risking your jobs for. Thankfully, we don't have to risk our lives for them anymore, because people in the past did that for us. And I think it's worth feeling inspired by the heretics of history as we go forward and do a bit of heresy today.
Yeah, I think one of the unfortunate consequences of this therapeutic turn in society where, as you say, the importance of the individual has been diminished. You're meant to believe that you're weak and you need help and that sort of thing, is that we have become rather weak compared to people who came before us, who've had to fight these extraordinary fights at great risk to their lives. But here, I don't know if you agree with me, but I feel like the West in particular, we've become a bunch of weaklings. I'm sure there are a few of us who are speaking out, and a few of us who stick our necks out there, and we take these positions. But I sometimes I feel like the vast majority of people surrounding the few are just weak, and they're always afraid. And why have we become so afraid?
It's interesting, isn't it? I do agree with you about that. There is a culture of passivity and self-doubt, not the good kind of self-doubt where you kind of question yourself and your ideas all the time, but the bad kind, which doubts one's own capacity even to act in the world without the scaffolding of therapeutic intervention and social advice and lifestyle advice. Yeah, there's a real culture of people thinking that they need experts to hold their hands all the time. And that's one of the great crimes of censorship. I think the great crime of censorship is the worst thing about censorship is not even that it stops someone from speaking, which is terrible, but that it stops the rest of us from making up our own minds. That is censorship's greatest crime, is to say to us, you don't have to think for yourself because we've done it for you. We've decided on your behalf that this idea is too dangerous. This book will trigger you too much. This film is too obscene. So we've made the decision. So you don't have to use your moral muscles. You don't have to use your mental muscles. You can just stew in your own ignorance and be very comfortable there. And over time, that weakens our moral muscles, and they get weak through underuse. And in fact, that's an argument that's been made throughout history. John Milton made it in England in the 1600s. John Stuart Mill made this argument in the 1800s in his book On Liberty. Both of them and others as well made the argument that it's only through exercising moral judgment and making decisions for ourselves that we become free, active members of society. And when you're no longer called upon to do that, when you're no longer called upon to make your own mind up about ideas or to make your own judgments about how to run your life or how to raise your family because someone else is doing it for you, then in John Stuart Mill's words, our only responsibility is to become ape-like imitators. We are ape-like imitators of people who have told us what to do and what to think. And I think there's a culture of that now. It's a culture of we will imitate the advice of our superiors. And then it's exacerbated by the therapeutic culture, which makes it even worse because that entices us all the time into a relationship of dependency with medical experts, therapeutic experts, lifestyle experts who apparently have the key to everything. So it's kind of depressing. I do think there's a class differential, which is very important. I think I kind of straddle two worlds. I come from a working class community in London, an Irish community. All my family do normal working class jobs. They don't do anything like what I do. And so that is a very useful thing. It keeps me quite grounded. And none of them buy into any of this at all. They are incredibly robust. They do hard jobs, difficult jobs. So you have to be robust. But they're also robust in their relationships and in how they think and with each other, with their children. They're firm. They don't be a wimp. You'll hear that. You would never hear that phrase in a school these days. It would be considered very offensive to say to a child, don't be a wimp, don't be a telltale, don't be a snitch, sort it out yourself. That's what they used to say to us at school, but they don't anymore. But I hear that in working class communities. There's a desire for children and young people to be resilient. But then in other sections of society, including those who have the most influence over culture, it's very different. They want to encourage the young to feel frail, to worry that their self-esteem is going to be damaged all the time, to try and cushion themselves from difficult ideas. So I think that class differential is important to understand in terms of thinking about how this might play out over time, how it might play out. But I do think that generally speaking, the more that the culture of wokeness and the culture of social authoritarianism and the culture of censorship grows and grows, the worse the problem of public weakness will become, because we will not have any pressure at all to think for ourselves or to decide for ourselves. Yeah. So I think these two things go in hand, wanting a more resilient, satisfying, confident public life in which people are confident and more willing to engage with each other, more willing to talk, more willing to debate, more willing to argue. If you want that, then you have to carry on challenging all the expressions of anti-human sentiment that we see in contemporary society. So I think it's a really difficult task challenging this culture of weakness, but I think it can be done. Yeah.
Finally, for you, final question for you, Brendan. What do you hope readers will take away from your book? How do you envision this heretical mindset shaping society moving forward?
I hope they enjoy it. I hope they find it funny and interesting. That's the first thing, I guess. But then I hope they take away from it just the sense that heresy is a good thing. And one of the points I make is that virtually every freedom and right and comfort we enjoy is the gift of people who dare to be heretical. And it's just important to remember that, not to be nostalgic, not to obsess over the past too much, but just to be aware that lots of the things we take for granted today in terms of what we know about the world, or the fact that we think women should have equal rights to men, or the fact that Black people should not be segregated from white people, or the fact that the sun is actually at the center of the solar system, not the earth. All these pieces of knowledge and information and progressive ideas that we hold very dear are all the products of people who were willing to go against the grain. All of them, every single one of them. And George Bernard Shaw made this point. He said, all great truths begin as blasphemies. And it's just worth reminding ourselves of that all the time. We're called blasphemers now if we say that men are men and women are women, or if we say that the vote for Brexit was a positive vote which should be seen through to its very end, or if we say that net zero is a problematic ideology which will impact harshly on working class communities in particular. If you say any of these things now, you will be called a climate change denier, you will be called a transphobe, you will be called a racist, you will be called basically a blasphemer. But I think even in the face of all that, it's important to carry on, because all great truths begin as blasphemies, and we have to accept the category and the position of a heretic in order to expand freedom more broadly over the coming years. So I hope people take the message that bravery has a lot to recommend it. Courage is an incredibly important virtue, and those who can be courageous should be, in order that we might challenge the irrationalism and the unfreedom that we are sadly living through at the moment.
Well, a Heretic's Manifesto, Essays on the Unsayable. I urge you all to get a copy of Brendan O'Neill's latest book. I think it isn't just a critique, it's a call to action, inviting us all to become heretics in an age of conformity. Thank you so much for joining me, Brendan, and I really hope to have you back here again soon.
Thank you so much.